So the question arises, what is global technography? And the answer to that, I will begin with an imperative that as long as technology continues to be treated as an intruder into our everyday lives rather than recognized as inseparably part of it, our understanding of the world is going to be flawed, and sometimes that can be dangerous. Most of what I've looked at hasn't been terribly dangerous for humanity, but we can actually extrapolate and find many instances in which technology breakdown or interaction with technology has led to disastrous consequences. The theoretical grounding for global technography is rooted in James Carey's ritual model of communication. And in particular, his description that we need to pay attention to the creation, the apprehension, and the use of our symbols. So for James Carey, the world is a complex set of interactions in which the individual is taught a symbolic order by society, then goes out into the world and both recognizes that use of the symbolic as a material practice and engages in it themselves, then goes back to join society and teach others of the very same symbolic order. It also includes actor network theory as an important element because it recognizes that technology is a social actant. That is, the technology is not a benign material that just sits there. It actually acts socially with us in our everyday encounters. And it also draws from Heidegger's philosophy of technology, which recognizes that humans are the engines of technology. We are the ones who drive technology forward, far from this utopia or dystopian idea that machines are somehow driving themselves. We're actually the ones that push technology forward. It also addresses Peter Lunenfeld's issue with digital dialectics. And Lunenfeld brought up the issue that determinism demarcates some answers as off limits, and we need to get past these entrenched positions. In this case, we can think about how we actually deal with technology in our everyday encounters. Some answers have been put off limits categorically before we even ask the question. And so Lunenfeld is saying we need to get past that in order to really understand how we're using this stuff. Global technography draws from several methodological principles. There's an interpretive ethnography described by Norman Denzin in which he distinguishes between what he calls authentic and spurious understanding. And so a spurious understanding is to be able to describe something phenomenologically as here's what happened or here's what looks like happened. But an authentic understanding would actually draw in the audience so that they might have some sense of what the experience of that phenomenon actually was, what it was like to be there. It also uses transcendental phenomenology and looks at how phenomena is meaningful for the people involved. And methodologically uses autoethnography. This is in particular the way that Bachner and Ellis describe it, that the researcher is situated within the study and contends with the issues of objectification within the text. And again, drawing from Norman Denzin's work, it uses performance ethnography, which focuses on the effects of social performativity rather than causality. So there are, according to Denzin, part of this mandate is to have radical utopian imaginings. How could things have been different? And this is important because if we want to change behavior, we have to have some sense of how we might behave otherwise. Methodologically, it draws from actor network theory by following the actant. and translating the text using words that the actors themselves would understand. And finally, global technography uses vignettes as a writing strategy. This is a strategy that was developed with my colleague Sharon Tettega, in which we try to approximate the experience in text for a reader by creating situated descriptions. And this allows the reader to encounter the text as if it were an ongoing drama of sorts. Observational focus is on the eruptions of technological performances. And this is to actually focus on the alliances of humans with technology. So when and where these eruptions happen is where the documentation takes place. The goal is documenting these experiences of mobility. Now, it's worth mentioning that this work was done a decade ago at this point. And this is a time when mobility, in particular global mobility, was a new thing. So looking back on it now, we can say, well, some of this seems pretty straightforward. But at the time, it was very new stuff. So an example of what this looks like now in the present, just the other day when I arrived in Moscow, I was looking at my phone and commented that something is happening in California. And that would have been a very strange comment just 10 or 15 years ago. Now it seems like a very commonplace phrase. So what this means, though, is not that this is over, that this inquiry, but actually it's moved on to a different set of concerns at this point, which I'm going to elaborate a little bit later. The early discoveries that were supported with this kind of research were broken into categories of mobility, materialities, and imaginaries. In terms of mobility, the discovery was this relationship to infrastructure, that global mobility depends on the extent of the network in that sense. And so even though it's a fluid kind of relationship within the network, the extent of the network to some degree still defines how mobile we can be. It's also proportional to what we might consider old world hierarchies, that participation in this system entails conformity. For example, most of our electronic equipment is actually programmed in English. So this is an old world hierarchy that entails a conformity of sorts on the technical level. But we can also, as a result, take home with us. We can entail many of our, or reproduce many of our practices that we would at home in other places. And so the definition of home, or what we think of as belonging, changes a little bit. We no longer have to be physically present in order to remain attached to our home network. In materialities, there's a remediation of rituals that allows the maintenance of our everyday life in transit. So even while we're passing through a space like an airport, we can remain connected with our network of safety, comfort, security, and so on. There's also an artifactual appropriation that works strategically, and it's not one way. So we are actually grasping these artifacts in a strategic way, informed by a logic that makes sense to us, but that at the same time, these objects are also imbuing a logic or conveying a logic to us. In terms of imaginaries, global technography discovered that mobility enables a new means of imagining performance and stabilizing our identities. For example, nationalism. It's because of this new means of imagining the self that someone like myself, who hasn't lived in Canada since 2002, can still consider myself very Canadian. I still know what's going on there. Whereas a couple of decades ago, it would have been very difficult for somebody to still imagine themselves as an active or participating citizen when living abroad for so long. Now, technologically, in the past decade, what has changed is an intensification of technological mobility. Our smartphone, the tablet, our cheap GPS guidance, things like this that we now carry with us have converged to such an extent that the technological experience is transcended the idea of having to carry objects around. And things like the Apple Watch, for example, have attempted to make this as much a part of our body fashion choice as putting on a tie. We also have new artifactual and performative materialities. These are different hardwares, softwares, and programmatic machinations. So we've seen experiments with things like Google Glass, but we're also getting things like virtual reality visors very soon, coming to market in a mass production way. And this is all very new. It's a game-changing type of technology as we immerse more and more into the virtual experience. We also have these new imaginaries that the technological dependence on our ontological security is intensifying. And what this means is that there's a conceptual collapse of virtual and physical space. So as I mentioned with the virtual reality visors, we're no longer able to distinguish so easily between what is a virtual experience and what is a physical world experience, especially when we bring in haptic feedback. So it feels like we're actually physically encountering things. And sociopolitically, we have an extreme portability of information and an intensified instantaneity that there is almost no delay from one part of the globe to another anymore. This has made mobility seem like a common sense, commonplace experience. Materially, we've had global financial crises and global financial empire oscillations that really show how we as a global community are tied together. There's been the commodification of genetics. There's been ongoing deployment of an array of authority. And we have new forms of appropriating labor that depend on this kind of mobility. We also have unprecedented stratification, and this is reflected in the space of flows, that only certain things go certain directions. And we also have the rise of social networking as a mass media format. This turns any individual into a potential mass broadcaster. This brings with it also disproportional effects, that any one person within the network can cause a ripple to go through the entire network. And at times it's caused crises, at times it has caused sensationalism, and often it's caused quite a lot of absurdity.